All right, folks, I'm ready to continue. I'm glad all of you are as well. You seem ready. All right, so let's move forward. So we're talking about marginal product, how to get that measure of productivity from the Cobb-Douglas production function, which represents the algebraic way of representing the most common production process, which we've been talking about since the start of this chapter, in which there are increasing returns and decreasing returns, um, and ultimately we'll have the properties we need to get us to the costs that will provide us the basic intuitions that you all need as managers to be able to make a lot of money in different industries. All right, so this is the Cobb-Douglas production function to get the marginal product of capital. In this example, we're not thinking about the short run. We're just assuming that both capital and labor are variable, and therefore it would be like a long run type situation. So to take the derivative of this with respect to capital to get the marginal product of capital, you take the partial derivative. I won't ever ask you to take a partial derivative in this course in like examples, but just follow the example here just to see where how you can get this this result from this production function. So to get the value, we have to take the partial derivative of the production function with respect to k. We denote the partial derivative as f subscript k. So if we're taking the partial derivative with respect to capital, we put that subscript k there just to highlight the fact that we're taking the derivative with respect to just this variable. Or if we're doing it with respect to just labor, then we put the subscript L there to denote that we're doing that. All right, so the partial derivative with respect to capital, so like I said, when you take the partial derivative, you ignore the other variable. You think of it as just a constant, like it's just a number. And remember, the derivative of a constant times a variable is the constant times the derivative of the variable. So here you basically just take the derivative of this term, so you multiply the whole thing by a, subtract 1 from a, and then you just multiply the whole thing by this constant, which is LB. And that's the partial derivative, which gets us the expression for the marginal product of capital, the extra amount of capital that can be produced by employing one more unit of capital, given a certain amount of labor that might be used. And then same thing with partial derivative with respect to labor. You multiply the whole thing by b, subtract 1 from b there, and you're left with this expression for the marginal product of labor. So recall that the profit maximizing use of an input occurs at the point where the value marginal product of an input is equal to the price of the input, which for labor is wage. For capital, the price of capital, we assume it to be the rental rate. It's called the rental rate of capital. So labor has a price, which is the wage. Capital has a price, which is the rental rate. All right, so here's a demonstration problem. A firm produces output that can be sold at $10 in the open market. The production function is given by this Cobb-Douglas production function. We're told that capital is fixed at 1 unit. Therefore, we are in the short run. So plugging that in will get us to our short run production function, which will just be a function of one variable, labor. The only way to expand output in the short run is by changing the amount of labor. So plugging in k equals 1, we're left with this production function, which is a short run production function, which will give us the total product given varying amounts of the labor input. All right, so the question is, how much labor should the firm employ to maximize profits if the wage is $2? So what are the things that we need to figure out here? Like, again, what are the things that we're equating in order to figure out the optimal amount of labor to hire in the short run? The value of the marginal product, the benefit of hiring an additional person equal to the cost of hiring an additional person, which is the wage rate. So we're going to take the derivative of that to get the marginal product of labor. And how do we get the value of the marginal product of labor once we do that? Multiply by price first, then set it equal to the wage, because we want to get the value of the marginal product of labor. Very good. All right, so taking the derivative of this with respect to labor, multiply the whole thing by 1/2, subtract 1 from the exponent. So that gets us to the marginal product of labor expression to be 1/2 times L raised to the power of negative 1/2. Again, that tells us how the extra amount of output is changing as you hire additional people, as you're moving along your production function. This will tell you the basically the estimate of that rate of change, which is the limiting position of the secant lines, which is the slope of that tangent line that we're interested in. And that slope will change as we move along the production function. So that's why you get an equation for the marginal product of labor, right? You plug in a certain amount of labor, it tells you, okay, at that amount of labor, if you hire one more person, this is how much extra output they can produce. So that's the marginal product of labor. We want to multiply that by the price to get the value of marginal product of labor, and then set that equal to the wage, and then we need to solve for the labor. So we've got marginal product of labor times the price, again, the extra amount of output produced by employing an additional unit of labor, multiplied by what that amount can be sold at in the open market, the price. So we've got the marginal product of labor times the price, which is equal to $10. Set that equal to the wage, which is equal to 2. 1/2 times 10 is equal to 5. 5L raised to the power of negative 1/2 equals 2. So we're trying to solve for labor here. So we'll divide both sides by 5 there. All right, now we need to isolate our variable L, right? To isolate the variable L, you need to get rid of the exponent. You get rid of the exponent by raising this to some power that is going to get the power equal to 1, right? So what do we multiply this by? So remember, when you have some number, in this case L, raised to some power, and in order to multiply that power by something, you need to raise the whole thing to some other power, right? In order to multiply the exponent. So what do we need to multiply this by to get 1? Not just 2, negative 2, exactly. So we need to raise this to the power of negative 2. That means we need to raise both sides to the power of negative 2. And that's going to get us 2 in this case. L equals, so I just put this like 1 over 2/5 squared. I squared that, and then I got the reciprocal of that, which is 25/4, and that's equal to 6.25 units. So, this is stuff you can just plug into your calculator, of course. So basically what this tells us is that the optimal amount of people to hire for this firm is 6.25 units, which is the profit maximizing level of people. So obviously you can't hire a quarter of a person because it would be kind of inhumane to a good extent. So obviously this tells us that 6 people is a profit maximizing level of folks to hire, given what the output can be sold at, given the nature of the production process, and the wage that is being paid to workers in the open market. All right, so that's the short run. Now we're going to talk about the long run. In order to talk about the long run, we use a similar framework, like I said, to the rational consumer choice model. So we're going to need things that kind of mimic the indifference curves, and then things that kind of mimic the budget constraint. The things that mimic the indifference curve are called isoquants. Iso, same, quants, quantity, same quantity. So the next task is to examine the optimal choice of capital and labor in the long run. In the presence of multiple variables of production, various combinations of input enable the manager to produce the same level of output. So you might use a little bit of labor and a lot of capital, or a lot of capital and a little bit of labor, and you could produce the same amount. So the question is, how much of those inputs should you choose in order to produce the amount you're looking to produce at the lowest cost possible? And that's what this whole framework is meant to answer. So the basic tool for understanding how alternative inputs can be used to produce output is an isoquant. An isoquant defines a combination of inputs, capital and labor, that yield the producer the same level of output. So By convention standard, we put capital on the y-axis and labor on the x-axis. So here is an isoquant, same quantity, meaning that all combinations of capital and labor along this curve will yield the same amount of output, which is 100 units of output. As we're moving along the isoquant, we're substituting labor for capital. We're lowering the amount of capital and increasing the amount of labor, but we're keeping the amount of output at the same amount. If we want to produce more, that can be represented by isoquants that are further away from the origin, just like we had the indifference curves that represented combinations of the two goods that can be consumed that yield the same level of satisfaction along an indifference curve. But as we went out from the origin, each indifference curve represented higher levels of utility of all consumption bundles along them. This is also a three-dimensional relationship, like the indifference curves represented the three-dimensional relationship between utility as a function of two goods that can be produced. This is output as a function of two inputs that can be used to produce output. So again, as we move further and further away from the origin, the isoquants represent higher levels of output. The second one represents 200 units of output. So you could have a lot of capital, a little bit of labor, a lot of labor, a little bit of capital, and they'll all produce 200. If you want to produce 300 units, then we go up to this isoquant, which again, along it means represents combinations of capital and labor that will yield the same amount of output, 300 units. The isoquants are convex. They have that same kind of like curved out shape as the indifference curve. That represents the fact that the inputs are not perfectly substitutable for each other. As you use more labor, the rate at which you would substitute labor for capital diminishes. We'll talk more about that in a second. So inputs such as capital and labor are typically are not perfectly substitutable. The rate at which labor can substitute for capital is called the marginal rate of technical substitution, and it is the slope of the isoquant. Much like the slope of the indifference curve was the marginal rate of substitution, the rate at which you could, the consumer could substitute one good for another and still maintain the same level of utility satisfaction. This is the rate at which a manager is able to substitute one input for another and maintain the same level of output, the marginal rate of technical substitution. The marginal rate of technical substitution of capital and labor is the absolute value of the slope of the isoquant and is simply the ratio of the marginal products. So much like for the indifference curves, the marginal rate of substitution was equal to the marginal utility of the good on the x-axis to the marginal utility of the good on the y-axis. The marginal rate of technical substitution is equal to the marginal product of the input on the x-axis, which is labor, to the marginal product of the input on the y-axis, which is capital. So the slope of the isoquants is equivalent to the ratio of the marginal products as you see here. That's the marginal rate of technical substitution. Different production functions imply different marginal rates of technical substitution. The linear production function that we considered implies isoquants that are linear. So this is what the isoquants look for the linear production function. The inputs are perfect substitutes for each other, and the rate at which the producer can substitute between the inputs is independent of the level of the input usage. So regardless of whether you're using a lot of capital or a lot of labor, the rate at which you can substitute capital for labor does not change. So the slope of the isoquants is always constant, and therefore you have these straight line isoquants. Specifically for the linear production function, we know that the marginal product of capital is equal to A, the marginal product of labor is equal to B, and therefore the marginal rate of technical substitution is just equal to B over A, the marginal product of labor over the marginal product of capital, which does not depend on the level of the inputs. L and K are not in there, so the rate at which you can substitute one for the other is constant. It's B over A. Doesn't change regardless of how much labor or how much capital is being used. This is independent of the level of inputs utilized. The other extreme case was the Leontief production function. And the Leontief production function implies isoquants that are L-shaped, like you see here. Essentially, you're using some level of labor, let's say, to produce some level of output. If you were to increase the amount of capital at that amount of labor, you couldn't increase the amount of labor. If you're using a certain level of capital and you start hiring a lot more people, you still couldn't influence your level of output. The only way you could increase your level of output is to increase both capital and labor in fixed proportions. And so the Leontief production function has these like right angle shaped isoquants. As a result of that, there is no marginal rate of technical substitution because there's no substitution amongst inputs along the isoquant. You can't maintain your level of output by adding more labor and taking away some capital. You need to increase both of them at the same time in order to have any effect on output. For most production relations, the isoquants lie somewhere in between the perfect substitutes and the fixed proportions cases. So the Cobb-Douglas production function falls into the in-between and most common case and has isoquants that are represented by these convex shapes. So now let's talk about what the convex shape means. So let's say the firm is producing at point A, they're producing 100 units, and they're using like this amount of labor and this amount of capital, let's say. So if they want to continue using the same amount, they want to continue producing the same amount of output, but they want to use a little bit more labor, then in this case, they have to increase the amount of capital by 1 unit to replace 1 unit of labor at that point, from point A to point B. So the marginal rate of technical substitution is just equal to 1 between these 2 points. But let's say the firm then wants to get rid of 1 more person and increase their capital. In order to get rid of that second person, that would limit the amount of labor they have even more than before. In order to substitute what that laborer was doing for the firm, they have to increase the amount of capital by 3 units in that case. So in that case, the marginal rate of technical substitution is equal to 3. So along the isoquant, moving from left to right, we have diminishing marginal rate of substitution. We go from 3 to 1, and then it gets even smaller and smaller as we move to the right. The reason for that is because of just the assumption of experience and know-how and adaptability of the inputs. So if you think about just any production process, there's going to be certain people that are specifically trained for that process, and they're going to be really good at it. But if you hire more and more people, those people aren't going to be really good at what's being done. Eventually, like over time, they will be. But initially, they're going to have to train. They're going to need some years of experience to get better at it. And so their productivity isn't going to be as much as like earlier units that were specifically intended for that production process. And so these earlier units of labor are going to be worth a lot in terms of capital, in terms of like the trade-off between using one input versus the other, in terms of the marginal rate of technical substitution. These laborers are worth a lot. Like this one laborer can produce as much as 3 machines. But as we move to the right and you're hiring less experienced people, then the less experienced people, they're worth less in terms of like the same amount of output that machines can produce. And so they can be substituted at a smaller rate than the more like knowledgeable employees that were intended for the process. So that's why you get that like diminishing marginal rate of technical substitution, the fact that the inputs are not perfectly substitutable for each other, because there is that whole other dimension of like, people being really good at something versus people really being really bad at something, and them needing time to get good at it. So like, folks over here, the more and more people you hire, the less they're worth in terms of that trade-off to capital, meaning as you hire more people, you you get rid of less and less capital in order to maintain the same level of output. The marginal rate of technical substitution is diminishing from left to right along the isoquant that is representative of the Cobb-Douglas production function. So this production function satisfies the law of diminishing marginal rate of technical substitution. As a producer uses less of an input, increasingly more of the other input must be employed to produce the same level of output. All right, so that's the ISO cost. That's the ISO quant portion of the model. Basically, again, establishing the rate at which you can substitute the two inputs into production to maintain the same level of output. Now we're going to throw in a budget constraint to some extent. It's not a constraint in the same way it is for consumers who have a certain amount of income and they can only purchase so much. It's a constraint more in terms of like the target of the firm, right? Like the firm wants to spend only a certain amount of money, but they could spend more money if they wanted to. But regardless, like they want to produce a given amount of output at the lowest cost possible. So we need to represent those costs in the model as well. And we do it via the ISO cost curve. ISO same, cost same cost. So the combination of inputs that will cost the firm the same amount comprise an ISO cost line. It looks just like a budget line, a budget constraint. It has the same properties. Each input has a price. Again, labor has a price, which is the wage. Capital has the price, which is the rental rate, which is what we call the price of capital in economics. And so if the firm were only to, so this is how much the firm wants to spend, and so the cost of the cost they're willing to pay is represented by this line, as a person's income is represented by their budget line, and so the varying combinations of capital and labor along this line yield the same amount of cost for the firm. If the firm only used capital, then it would use no labor, and it would be producing at this point on its ISO cost line, which again, you can get the most amount of capital that's being produced by dividing the cost that the firm is willing to incur by the price of the input, which is the rental rate. So that's what that represents. And then this represents the most amount of labor that can be hired within that budget. Again, you've got that cost of C divided by the cost of labor, which tells you the most amount of labor. And then, of course, the points in between on the line represent combinations of labor and capital that cost the same. Suppose a firm does spend exactly C on inputs. The cost of labor plus the cost of capital exactly equals C. And so you've got, again, a similar expression to what we had with the budget constraint for the consumer that had the price of X, the price of good X times the amount of good X plus the price of Y times the amount of good Y equals the budget. In this case, the amount of labor times its cost plus the amount of capital times its cost equals the overall cost to the firm. Again, W is the wage rate and R is the rental rate, the price of capital. So we may obtain a more convenient expression for the slope of and the intercept of an ISO cost line by turning this into a slope-intercept form. So basically solving for capital in terms of labor. So here we multiply both sides by 1 over R to get rid of that R from coefficient on K. We get this expression here. And then subtract this term from both sides. Solving for K, we get this expression here for the budget, for the ISO cost line. And so here again is our y-intercept representing the most amount of capital that can be employed if only capital was used under this cost constraint. And then this is the slope of the ISO cost line. It's the ratio of the price of the input on the x-axis to the price of the input on the y-axis. Much like the slope of the budget constraint was equal to the ratio of the price of the good on the x-axis to the price of the good on the y-axis. So it's got the same mathematical properties. And it basically represents the market rate of substitution between the two inputs based on the prices that are being set in markets for the inputs. So the rate at which you can you can exchange labor for capital in open markets, versus the marginal rate of technical substitution, the slope of the iso-quant line, representing the rate at which you, based on your needs in your factory or whatever, and your production process, the rate at which you can substitute capital for labor in order to maintain the same level of output. If the producer wishes to use more of both inputs, then more money must be spent. ISO costs associated with higher costs lie above those with lower costs. So once again, if the firm wants to incur greater costs, then they would be operating on a higher ISO cost line, further away from the origin. When input prices are constant, the ISO cost lines will be parallel to one another. So we assume that they're just looking to spend more, and the prices of the inputs aren't changing in open markets, like the price of labor, wage, the price of capital, the rental rate aren't changing, then you're just going to get parallel ISO cost lines. Changes in input prices affect the position of the ISO cost line. So an increase in the price of labor makes the ISO cost curve steeper. So again, you have labor, maybe again the minimum wage was increased or something, or just wages were raised within the factory, who knows. But given the amount of costs that the firm is willing to spend on the production process, that means that the ISO cost line will pivot in, and the most amount of labor that can be used will obviously be less than the most amount of labor that could have been used at the lower wage rate. An increase in the price of capital makes it flatter. So if the rental rate were to increase, so that's the opposite case, then you would have obviously the y-intercept moving closer to the origin, representing a lower amount of capital that can be used given the amount of cost the firm is willing to take on for the production process. All right, now let's throw both components together to get to cost minimization. So the ISO costs and ISO quants may be used to determine the input usage that minimizes production costs. So, so here we've got a certain amount of output, 100 units, and we see that at this point, using this amount of capital and this amount of labor to produce this amount of output will cost the firm C1, whatever that cost is that's reflected by this ISO cost line. But obviously they can do better. Like they can be on a lower ISO cost line and still produce that same amount of output. So if the producer uses input mix A, he or she will produce Q1 units of output at the total cost of C1. But let's say they were to use input mix B, using less capital and more labor, because labor is probably cheaper than capital. Then they could produce the same amount of output at a lower cost. So recall that the absolute value of the slope of the ISO quant reflects the marginal rate of technical substitution, which is the ratio of the marginal product of labor to the marginal product of capital. Also, the slope of the ISO cost line is given by the negative ratio of the price of the input on the x-axis to the price of the input on the y-axis, the negative ratio of the wage rate to the rental rate. So that's the slope of the ISO cost line. At the cost minimizing input mix B, the slope of the ISO quant is equal to the slope of the ISO cost line. So at point A, we see that the slope of the ISO quant is greater than the slope of the ISO cost line, which means that as far as the production process goes, a labor costs more than the market rate of substitution for labor, meaning that it just makes sense to use more labor because the firm values labor more than what they have to pay for it in the open market. And so they would move along the ISO cost line to that point where they can produce the same amount of output. They would move along the ISO quant line to that point where they would produce the same amount of output and use more labor and less capital and minimize their costs. So again, up here, capital is too expensive, so the producer finds it in capital is too expensive up here, and that means labor is cheap up there. So the producer finds it in his or her interest to use less capital and more labor to produce the given level of output. The substitution continues until ultimately the producer is at point B, where the marginal rate of technical substitution is equal to the ratio of the input prices. So again, the rate at which the firm is willing to trade off labor for capital is greater here than the market requires. And so essentially, it's cheaper for the firm to use more labor. And so they do over here. But let's say over here, the rate at which the firm is willing to trade off labor for capital is less than what the market requires. And so in that case, labor is more expensive than the firm is willing to pay for labor. And so they would use less labor and more capital and move back to point B. So the condition for cost minimizing use of inputs can be stated in terms of marginal products. As we know, the marginal rate of technical substitution is equal to the negative ratio of the marginal product of labor to the marginal product of capital. At the cost minimizing input mix, that is equal to the negative ratio of the wage rate over the rental rate, which implies, if we move these things around, that at the cost minimizing level of inputs, the extra amount of output per dollar spent on each input is equivalent. So if a dollar is spent at that point on labor, or if a dollar is spent at that point on capital, the extra amount of output is going to be equivalent. Versus anywhere else, you're going to get a situation where maybe the marginal product of the extra amount of output per labor is greater than the marginal product of capital the marginal product of labor per dollar spent is greater over here than the marginal product per dollar spent on capital. So you spend $1 on capital over here, you're going to produce less than if you spend $1 on labor, so it makes sense to use more labor. And so you move to the optimal input mix, the cost minimizing input mix. So again, at point A, you've got, again, the extra amount of output per dollar spent is greater than the extra amount of output per dollar spent on capital. So again, it makes sense to use more labor than capital. To minimize costs on a last dollar spent basis, labor is cheaper than capital and the firm should use less capital. Getting us to the principle, the cost minimizing input rule. To minimize the cost of producing a given level of output, the marginal product per dollar spent should be equal for all inputs. So this condition is ultimately what's most important from this analysis that we're using with the ISO quant and ISO cost framework. Demonstration problem. Terry's Lawn Service rents 5 push mowers and 2 large riding mowers to cut the lawns of neighborhood households. So their two inputs are these large mowers and small motors, not mowers. 2 large mowers and small mowers versus capital and labor. Those are the 2 inputs. The marginal product of a small push mower is 3 lawns per day, and the marginal product of the riding mower is 6 lawns per day. The rental price of a small push mower is $10 per day, whereas the rental price of a large riding mower is $25 per day. Is Terry's Lawn Service utilizing small push mowers and large riding mowers in a cost minimizing manner is the question. So then the question is, are the ratios of the marginal product per type of mower to their prices equivalent at the amount that they're using? So we have to check that. So we'll let the marginal product of S be the marginal product of a small push mower, the marginal product L be the marginal product of the large riding mower. We'll let PS equal the price of the small push mower and PL be the price of the large push mower or riding mower, respectively. So cost minimization requires that, again, these expressions be equivalent, that the extra amount of output of lawns mowed per type of mower per dollar spent be equivalent at the cost minimizing level of the 2 inputs. So substituting in the appropriate values, we see that the marginal product of the large push mower to its price is equal to 6/25, which is equal to 0.24. That means that each additional dollar spent on the large push mower yields 0.24 extra lawns mowed. if we do the same thing for the small push mowers, we get 3 over 10, which equals to 0.3. That means that a dollar spent on the small push mowers yields a third of a lawn mowed. So we see that they are not equivalent. So what should this firm do then? Use the small and less of the large. Right, exactly. Use a little bit more of the small and a little bit less of the large in order to get those equivalent, in order to minimize their costs. So the marginal product per dollar spent on small push mowers exceeds the marginal product per dollar spent on large riding mowers. Riding mowers are twice as productive as push mowers, but more than twice as expensive. The firm is not minimizing costs and thus should use fewer riding mowers and more push mowers. So that relationship between the marginal products and the prices is really important and can be applied to any situation in which there's varying amounts of inputs that are being used, and you know their prices and you know their marginal products. So you can use this relationship to figure out, are you using it in the most cost minimizing fashion? All right, so what happens to that optimal input mix when the price of an input changes? So a change in the price of an input will lead to a change in the cost minimizing input bundle. So let's say the firm is looking to produce Q0 units of output, and they are minimizing costs with K1 units of capital and L1 units of labor. Suppose the initial ISO cost is, of course, FG, and the producer is cost minimizing at A. Suppose the wage rate increases so that its ISO cost line would rotate clockwise to FH, as we see here. So the cost minimizing way to maintain the same level of output is going to be at point B. So essentially, with that new higher wage, the firm, in order to produce the same amount of output, would need to spend more money, and basically employ K2 units of capital and L2 units of labor. Labor has now gotten more expensive, so they use more units of capital to produce the same units of output. The production process has become more capital intensive versus labor intensive as a result of labor becoming more expensive. They can still produce the same amount of output, but they need to use more capital versus labor because labor is now more expensive. So the producer substitutes away from labor and toward capital and adopts a more capital-intensive mode of production. Getting us to the principle of the optimal input substitution. To minimize the cost of producing a given level of output, the firm should use less of an input and more of the other inputs when that input's price rises. Kind of intuitive, but we can get that clear intuitive result from the ISO cost, ISO quant framework. All right, now let's move to the cost function. So for given input prices, different ISO quants will entail different production costs. So again, as you're moving further and further away from the origin, representing higher and higher levels of output that can be produced, to produce more output, you're going to need to employ more of both capital and labor, and therefore costs will be increasing. Since the cost of production increases as higher ISO quants are reached, it's useful to let C of Q denote the cost to the firm of producing ISO quant Q in the cost minimizing fashion. So we establish a relationship between costs and the quantity of output, and we assume that that relationship is always going to reflect that cost minimizing input mix that is that tangency point between the ISO quants and the ISO costs. The function C is called the cost function. The cost function reduces the amount of information the manager has to process to make optimal output decisions. All right, so let's look at short-run costs. So in the short run, because you have a fixed input into production, you're going to have a fixed cost into production, right? So the amount of capital that you're employing costs you something. That's not changing because you can't change the amount of capital. So part of your total cost is going to be the cost of that fixed input, which is your fixed cost. And then, of course, you're going to have a variable cost, the cost that's going to change as you choose to increase the amount of output you want to produce. The only way you can do that is by varying your variable input, which means by assumption to hire more people because that's your only variable input by assumption. So fixed costs denoted FC are costs that do not vary with the output and include the cost of fixed inputs used in production. Variable costs, denoted as VC of Q, are costs that change when output is changed and include the cost of inputs that vary with output. So this is what we call the short run cost function. It summarizes the minimum possible cost of producing each level of output when variable factors are being used in the cost minimizing way. So here is just an example of the cost function tabularly represented. We've got a fixed amount of capital at 2 units. We've got our variable input, which as we increase it, will increase the amount of output that can be produced. We've got a fixed cost to our input. The rental rate is $1,000, so 1,000 times 2 is $2,000. So our fixed cost is $2,000, regardless of the amount of our variable input. I'm sorry, my pointer is running out of batteries, but I have a spare. There you go. All right, so again, our fixed input is fixed. The cost of it is fixed as well, so that's our fixed cost. So we see that regardless of how much output we're producing, the cost is the same for our fixed input. It's $2,000. Variable costs, of course, will increase as we are deciding to increase our output by employing more of our variable input. So the wage is equal to $400. So again, if you hire one person, the variable cost is $400. If you hire a second person, variable cost is $800. Third, variable cost is $1,200. And the total cost, of course, is the sum of our variable and fixed costs, right, at any given level of output. And that is the cost minimizing costs. So at 2 laborers, we've got a fixed cost of $2,000. We've got a variable cost of 2 times 400, which is 800. So we got a total cost of 2,800, and that relationship holds throughout the table, throughout the cost function, reflecting this short-run production process. So that's the discrete case that we represent tabularly. Here's the continuous case that we represent graphically. Again, we're assuming output is infinitely divisible, so there's decimal values of output that can be produced. All right, so here is our total cost function. Here's our variable cost function, and here is our fixed cost function. So the total cost is going to represent and reflect the properties that we talked about with respect to production overall. So initially, you have that increasing returns range to production in which you hire additional folks and they produce more than the prior folks. That means that each additional unit of output, the marginal cost of each additional unit of output will be decreasing. The extra amount that you have to spend on each additional unit will be less than the prior unit because of those increasing returns. And so that's represented by the slope of the total cost function along this initial range here, where we see that the slope is getting flatter and flatter and flatter. As you're employing more people and you get that increasing returns, the extra cost of producing additional units is diminishing. So you have the cost of producing one more unit is less than the cost of producing the prior unit. Up until the point where, again, you hit that short run wall where you get diminishing returns to the input. Each additional unit that you hire produces less than the prior unit because they're limited by the amount of capital. And so because of that, the extra cost of producing additional units starts to increase. The marginal cost starts to increase, which is the slope of our total cost function. And so that's when you see the slopes start to increase as it does. Total cost is equal to fixed cost plus variable cost. Fixed cost doesn't change. So this represents the fixed cost of production. So therefore, our variable cost function is basically the total cost function, and it's just shifted by the distance of the fixed cost. And so the marginal cost, the extra cost of producing additional units, is dependent on the variable cost, on what's happening with the variable cost, and that is reflective of what we understand to result from the production process that we're talking about, that has increasing returns and then decreasing returns. So therefore, the variable cost is exactly the same shape as the total cost function, and it's just shifted down by the distance of the fixed cost. So at this level of output, this is our variable cost, this is our total cost. The difference between the two is the fixed cost. All right, so one common misperception about costs is that larger firms have lower costs than smaller firms because they produce larger quantities of output. What individuals most likely have in mind when they consider the advantages of producing large quantities of output is that the overhead, the fixed cost, is spread out over a larger level of output. Therefore, it's important to consider the average fixed cost. The average fixed cost is defined as the fixed cost divided by the number of units of output. So remember, the cost of the fixed input is fixed. So a firm, they set up their factory, they buy their tools, they buy their assembly lines, and they go. As they increase their output, that fixed cost is being divided by a number that gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And so for each additional unit of output that's produced, if you want to break that down into its individual components of like how much of that is the fixed cost and how much of that is the variable cost, well, then you look at the average fixed cost, you look at the average variable cost. The fixed cost, as you increase the amount of output, will be spread out more and more over all the units as you produce more and more. And so therefore, average fixed cost will be smaller and smaller and smaller as you produce more and more and more. The average fixed cost is going to be spread out. There's a spreading effect of increasing the size of the scale of production that is due to, again, the fact that your cost of your fixed input isn't changing. So here you have a number that's not changing. Here you have a number that gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And so the average fixed cost will always decrease for a firm as they increase the amount of output in the short run. Average variable cost, of course, is going to be the other component of their overall average cost, and it's defined as the variable cost divided by the number of units of output. So the variable cost is going to be changing. And so therefore, average variable cost will be changing as well as you vary the amount of output that's being produced. The average total cost is defined as the total cost divided by the number of units of output. And it's going to be equal to the sum of the average fixed cost plus the average variable cost. All right, so here again is production function reflecting costs. Here's the amount of output that's being produced as the variable input is being increased, which is represented here by the increasing variable cost. Fixed costs remain constant there. Total costs start to increase, will always increase, but at differing rates. Depending on what's happening to increasing or diminishing returns. Average fixed costs will always be decreasing. So here we've got, let me see, 76 units of output being produced. The fixed cost is 2,000, so it's 2,000 divided by 76 gives us 2632. So for each of these units, at 76 units of output, the component of their cost, that is fixed, is $26.32. The variable costs divided, so you have $400 divided by the 76 units of output. The variable cost in this case is going to be $526. The sum of those two, the average fixed cost plus the average variable cost, is equal to $31.58. Average fixed cost will decrease forever as you increase the scale of production. Average variable costs initially will decrease because of those diminishing returns. I'm sorry, because of the increasing returns. And then eventually they will start to increase because of the diminishing returns effect. And so initially we've got average total costs, which due to increasing returns will actually be decreasing, and also because of the spreading effect of the average fixed cost. So both of these are causing the average total cost to go down. But eventually the average total cost will start to increase as well, because the decreasing returns to our variable input will start to bring up the average variable cost, which will then start to overpower the spreading effect of the average fixed cost, which then starts to bring average total cost up as well. And so average variable costs will decrease, then increase, and so will average total costs. All right, now let's throw marginal cost into this. So marginal cost is the cost of producing an additional unit of output. It's the change in cost attributable to the last unit of output. It is the derivative or slope of the cost function at any given point. So again, here's our output. Here's our change in quantity from 0 to 76 units, which means that we've hired one person. Their marginal product of labor is 76 units. The variable cost is 400. So the change in output is 76 units. The change in costs is $400, going from 0 to 1 unit. And so the marginal cost is the ratio of the change in total costs with respect to the change in output. So 400 divided by 76. So our marginal cost is equal to 5.26, meaning that over that range of going from 0 to 76 units of output, which again, you're going from having no workers to having a worker, the extra cost of producing additional units is on average, in this case, $5.26. So we see that marginal cost is initially going to be decreasing, and then it will start to increase. And again, it has everything to do with the fact that initially you have those increasing returns and then decreasing returns to the input. When only one input is variable, the marginal cost is the price of that input divided by its marginal product. So in this case, we're talking about the marginal product of labor, which is the only input that is being used to expand output. We know that the marginal product of labor initially is increasing, then decreasing. So then you have 1 over a number that's decreasing. That's going to get you a bigger number. So marginal cost will be bigger over the decreasing returns range. And then, the increasing returns range initially. And then as marginal product of labor starts to get smaller, and you have 1 over a number that's getting smaller, which means that number is getting bigger. So marginal costs will get bigger when the marginal product of labor starts to diminish because of diminishing returns. So marginal product increases, initially reaches a maximum and then decreases. Given the marginal cost is the reciprocal of marginal product times the input price, it decreases as marginal product increases and increases when the marginal product is decreasing. So let's look at this relationship among the various costs. So again, marginal cost is going to decrease and then it's going to increase. So just graphically, we're going to represent it by kind of like this swoosh shape, kind of like the Nike swoosh shape. And that is going to, again, reflect the properties of the production that we assume to be very general for most production processes. So the figure is going to depict the curves in the continuous case under the assumption that output is infinitely divisible, as is the case with graphs. So here is our average variable cost. Our average variable cost will initially be decreasing and then start to increase, again, due to the fact that we have increasing returns to labor initially and then decreasing returns to labor, which starts to bring our average variable cost up. The extra cost of producing additional units will have that same relationship to average cost as marginal product had to average product. So as we're increasing the amount of output, This again represents the average variable cost, the average amount of the cost of producing additional units that is attributable to our variable input, which is labor. So we see that it is below the, it's above the marginal cost initially, but marginal costs as we, initially expand the production process will be decreasing, which will be bringing down the average variable cost up until the point where they cross. And then once marginal cost, the extra cost of producing additional units, is greater than the average variable cost, it will start to bring up average variable cost. And therefore, the lowest point of the average variable cost curve will happen at the point where it is equal to marginal cost. And that's important because the decisions that firms will make will be reliant on one of the important decisions that firms will make will be reliant on that point where average variable cost is at its minimum. All right, so here's the average total cost curve. It's also got that U shape because, again, it does decrease and then increase, but it has more than just the average variable cost acting upon it. We also know that a component of the average total cost is the average fixed cost, and we know that the average fixed cost is always decreasing. So initially, we have average variable costs that are decreasing. That's pulling down the average total cost. But we also have the average fixed costs that are being spread out, and that's bringing down the average total cost. At this point where marginal cost starts to pull up average variable costs, we still see that the total cost curve is still diminishing. So the average cost of producing is still going down even after the average variable cost starts to increase, and that's because the spreading effect of the fixed cost is still overpowering the diminishing returns effect of the variable cost, which is still bringing down the average total cost. And therefore, the minimum of the average total cost will happen after the minimum of the average variable cost, and it will happen at the same point as it does for the average variable cost, the point at which marginal cost crosses it. Once the extra amount it costs to produce additional units exceeds the average total cost, that will start to bring up average total cost, and that again represents the point where the diminishing returns effect to our variable input starts to overpower the spreading effect of the fixed costs that are being spread out over the scale of your production and start to bring up your average cost of production. So notice that the average total cost minimum is to the right of the average variable cost minimum. So again, over this range where average total costs are still decreasing, even though average variable costs are increasing, that's where the spreading effect from the spreading out of the fixed cost is dominating. At low levels of output, the spreading effect is very powerful because even small increases in output can cause large reductions in average fixed costs and cause the average total cost curve to slope downwards. To the right of the average total cost minimum, where the marginal cost crosses it, the dominant effect is the diminishing returns effect. So beyond that point, diminishing returns effect dominates and brings up the average total cost of production. So that's the nature of the total cost that a firm incurs as a result of being faced with a fixed input. They will be able to increase output and decrease their average cost of producing over a certain range, but at some point they're going to hit a minimum to that, and then they're going to start increasing their cost, and that's going to have everything to do with their average cost of production, and that's going to have everything to do with the fact that they are in the short run and they are limited by that fixed input. So again, this causes the average total cost to turn down from downward sloping to upward sloping, creating the U shape. Just a brief note on fixed and sunk costs. So I think we talked about sunk costs at some point in this class, but sunk costs are costs that cannot be retrieved at the time a decision is being made. Essentially, it's like spilled milk, and there's no sense crying over it. So sunk costs should be ignored, but fixed costs can partly be sunk costs. So a sunk cost is a cost that is lost forever once it's been paid. Imagine you are the manager of a coal company and you've just been paid $10,000 to lease a rail car for a month. The amount of the $10,000 that is sunk depends on the terms of your lease. If the lease does not permit you to recoup any of the $10,000. Once it's been paid, the entire $10,000 is a sunk cost. If the lease states that you will be refunded $6,000 in the event that you do not need the rail car, then only $4,000 of the $10,000 of the fixed cost is a sunk cost. Since sunk costs are lost forever, once they've been paid, they are irrelevant to decision making. So that just brings us to the principle of irrelevance of sunk costs. A decision maker should ignore sunk costs to maximize profits or minimize losses. So it shouldn't be taken into account when doing like a cost analysis in order to optimize their production processes. All right, let's look at the algebraic form of the cost function. So we've looked at tabular data reflecting the cost function. We've looked at curves via graphs that, again, reflect the same relationships. But now, of course, we're going to jump to the equations, which is ultimately what you need to do in this class, because the other stuff you've already covered in your introductory micro courses. So in practice, cost functions may take many forms, but the cubic cost function is frequently encountered and closely approximates any cost function. So it's the most common way to specify a cost function that will have the properties that we need to reflect the production process we're talking about, to reflect the nature of the cost that we've been talking about. So the cubic cost function is given by this expression here. So you're going to have some fixed costs. That's going to be F. So essentially, there's no variable associated with that. There's no Q associated with that. So any term in a cost function that doesn't have the Q associated with it is going to be the fixed cost of production. And then all these other terms are going to represent our variable costs. So AQ plus BQ squared plus CQ cubed represents the variable cost, since as we learned, total cost equals fixed cost plus variable costs. Given an algebraic form of the cubic cost function, we may directly calculate the marginal cost function by taking the derivative of this. The derivative of a constant is equal to 0. What's the derivative of this term? A is just a number, right? So remember, q raised to the power of 1, multiply the whole thing by 1, subtract 1 from that exponent. You got q raised to the power of 0, which is equal to 1, which leaves you with A. What's the derivative of this term? 2bq, and what's this? 3cq squared, exactly. So the marginal cost is the derivative of this function, which again is equal to A plus 2bq. 2 times this, subtract 1 from the exponent there. And then 3 times this, subtract 1 from the exponent there, gets us to 3cq squared. The book presents this equation as though you should memorize it. That's a silly approach. You should take the derivative. You've taken a business calculus course. I've reviewed the derivative with you. There's no reason why you shouldn't be able to take the derivative. And you should take it. Don't memorize equations. Demonstration problem. The cost function for managerial enterprises is given by this expression here. What's the fixed cost? What's the variable cost? Very good. Determine the marginal cost, average fixed cost, average variable cost, and average total cost when Q equals 10. What is our marginal cost function here? 6Q, right? The derivative of a constant is equal to 0. The derivative of this term, 2 times 3 is 6. Subtract 1 from there, so that's 6Q. Marginal cost is equal to 6Q. We're looking for marginal cost of 10 units. So plugging in 10 units there, that gives us $60. That means that if you're producing 10 units, if you produce one more unit, it's going to cost the firm $60. Marginal cost of production. Average fixed cost. So again, we know our fixed cost is equal to 20. Divide that by 10. That's going to get us to $2. So our average fixed cost of production at 10 units is $2. The average variable cost of production, so we take our variable cost, 3Q squared, divide that by Q. That's going to simplify that to 3Q. Plug in 10. That means that at 10 units, on average, the wages that we're paying our employees is factoring in $30 worth of cost to each unit produced. Right? On average, the average variable cost is $30 when you're producing 10 units. Average total cost, what is that? $32, right? The sum of the average fixed cost plus the average variable cost. All right, long run costs. So in the short run, you're limited by the amount of the fixed input you have. You start producing, you realize, okay, we've minimized costs, but if we keep increasing, our average cost is going to start to increase. So we need to, at some point, get more capital. When you're at the point that you can get more capital, you're in the long run. As soon as you buy that new capital, though, you're in a new short run situation. So here, so in the long run, all costs are variable because the manager is free to adjust the level of all inputs. So initially, you're at some short run situation represented by this average total cost curve. You're producing this amount of output, Q0, and that's your average total cost of production. Each unit is costing you on average this much to produce. You want to increase your output. You keep increasing your output because the market is letting you. People are buying your stuff. You want to sell more stuff. So you start selling more stuff, and you wind up in the upward sloping area of your average total cost, where diminishing return effects are dominating your average total cost, driving them up. So to produce Q1 units of output, you now have to spend on average this much on it, which is higher than what you spend down here. Obviously, that's causing a problem for you. It's becoming expensive for you to produce the things. Maybe it's not going to be worth it to you anymore because the price is maybe not going to meet that average total cost. So what's the best thing to do? Increase your capital. So you're in the long run. You can increase your capital. You do. You buy a bunch of capital. You get a bigger factory. You double the size of your factory. You get bigger machines that are more efficient. Once again, when you do that, you are in a new short run situation. In this case, average total cost 1. That amount of output you were producing now for this new average total cost curve representing that new short run is going to get you an average total cost of production of ATC1, which is way lower than what you were spending before. Things are going well. You want to sell more. You increase your output. So you do. You increase your output all the way to Q2. Unfortunately, you're still in that second short run situation, which is bringing your average total cost up significantly. So now, again, you got to increase the size of your factory again. You got to buy more capital. So you're in the long run. You do that. Once again, you're in a short run situation represented by this average total cost curve. You've managed to minimize that total cost, though, of that Q2 unit. And so things are going well once again. So the long run average total cost curve, denoted by LRAC, defines the minimum average cost of producing alternative levels of output, allowing for the optimal selection of all variables of production, both fixed and variable factors. The long run average cost curve is the lower envelope of all the short run average cost curves. It's this red curve that you see here. This means that the long run average cost curve lies below every point on the short run average cost curve, except that it equals each short run average cost curve at the points where the short run curve uses fixed factors optimally. So given the nature of long run average costs, then we can talk about this thing called economies of scale. So the U-shape of the long run average cost curve implies that initially an expansion of output allows the firm to produce at lower long run average cost, as is shown for outputs between 0 and Q star. So in the long run, as you increase your amount of capital to get to those new short run situations, you are going to benefit from decreasing average total cost. That is known as economies of scale. You will be taking advantage of economies of scale. As you get bigger, your average cost of producing will decrease in the long run. When there are economies of scale, increasing the size of the operation decreases the minimum average cost. After a point such as Q, further increases in output lead to an increase in average cost. So even in the long run, even as you try to minimize your cost, eventually you will be increasing your average cost of production. This is known as diseconomies of scale. So over this range, you're going to have diseconomies of scale. Sometimes the technology in an industry allows a firm to produce different levels of output at the same minimum average cost. In this case, you have constant returns to scale. So different industries will have different economies of scale. So what explains the scale effects in production? The answer lies in the firm's technology of production. So increasing returns arise from increased specialization. So as a firm gets bigger and bigger, they're able to sort of divide up the tasks to the most minute level, becoming as efficient as possible in the long run, increasing their output as much as they can to decrease that average cost of producing. The bigger they get, the lower it costs them to produce. A larger scale of operation means that individual workers can limit themselves more to specialized tasks, becoming more skilled and efficient at doing them. Another source of increasing returns is very large initial setup costs. So if you have a firm that requires a huge amount of fixed costs to set up shop, some like huge scale operation, then that amount of fixed costs is going to have a huge spreading effect for a very long period of time, for a huge range, maybe over just the most relevant range for the firm, and they will always be operating over the economies of scale, the economies of scale, increasing returns to scale portion of the long run average cost curve. A third source of increasing returns is network effects. So network effects have to do with the product that's being produced. If more people find it valuable, the more people use it, then the average cost of producing it will decrease, like with like Microsoft Windows. More people wound up using it, so it became like the thing that everybody used, and ultimately it became super cheap to produce. And so the network effects of that technology was another source of increasing returns to scale, at least for Microsoft. Decreasing returns to scale is the opposite scenario, and it typically arises in large firms due to problems of coordination and communication. Some firms get too big. When you get like these huge like firms that are getting together, like, oh yeah, we're multi-billion-dollar firms, let's merge and become multi-trillion-dollar firms, ha ha. Yeah, they do that, but they forget that like there's only so much firms can do to kind of like have like that synergism that you need to like work really efficiently. When you have two huge companies that are coming together, you're going to have huge egos at the top at every level, and it's going to be very hard for them to like synchronize and become one unit. And so they're going to get so large that they're just going to be incapable of like increasing their efficiency. They're going to start getting in each other's way. They're going to start sort of creating internal conflicts that are going to be incapable of surmounting, which will cause their average total cost to increase. And so they will reach eventually that point of diseconomies of scale. And that's why firms can't just become infinitely huge. There is a limit to how big firms can get, how big enterprises can get. Ultimately, there are people in all these enterprises, and people are complicated. Therefore, it can become complicated to become super big. Although increasing returns induce firms to get larger, decreasing returns tend to limit their size. And when there are constant returns to scale, scale has no effect on a firm's long-run average total cost. It is the same regardless of whether the firm produces 1 unit or 100,000 units. So the nature of the industry that a firm operates in, which will be reflected by their long-run average cost curve, will dictate in part how competitive that industry can get. In some industries, it makes sense for firms to get really big, and if they get really big, enjoying those long-run average total cost decreases, which again are embodied by economies of scale, increasing returns to scale. In those industries, only a few large firms will dominate because that's the nature of that industry. You have to be that large to even have a competitive advantage, and only so many firms can get that large. And so you will have industries that are not very competitive that have those economies of scale. Constant returns to scale, that won't matter in firms. In industries where you can easily get into that diseconomies of scale range, you're going to wind up having more competition in those industries because firms don't want to get too big in those industries. All right, so this final topic we'll talk about at the beginning of next class. I did not finish Chapter 5, so what I'll do is I will open up the Chapter 5 homework, but it won't be due until a week from Sunday. But I do recommend that you do it because, again, we're going to cover 2 chapters next week, so there'll be a lot of homework that following week. You might want to avoid that. And also, you don't want to forget everything I covered today. You want to think about these things again because, again, they are going to be the basis of the intuition for all the analysis going forward. All right, folks, good job on sitting through this entire lecture. My hat is again off to you. Have a good night. Enjoy your week. Do try to spend some time relaxing and enjoying your lives, but definitely this is the middle of the semester. We're in the middle of it, so like you have to be in this 100% if you want this to work out the way you want it to. All right, have a good one. I'll see you next week. And I don't want to give you your test back.